Thank you, Peter, for your extensive contribution. And there is time to hold a discussion. Please, if you have, please.
Yes. Thanks very much for these two very interesting talks. And I'm trying to be short and precise here. I think I want to comment on Nick, and I have a very critical remark, and I also have a very endorsing remark, and you can choose which one you want me to progress first.
Okay.
Which one do you want to go?
Oh, I pick. Just jump in. I don't know. Pick your first one.
Okay, I start with the criticism, and then I come to the endorsement. My criticism is the Majoret, this contention that Hegel's dialectic was an impediment to Marx, that Hegel was a real theoretical impediment to Marx, that rather than the contradiction and the negation, we have to establish a positive, substantialist, synthetic, as you said, dialectic, to eliminate, so to speak, the contradictions. And I wonder, how does this work? The problem is that, of course, the contradiction in Capital is not the contradiction between the workers and the capitalists. That is not the contradiction of Capital. The contradiction of Capital is the concept of capital itself. And this is what Marx always stresses in the Grundrisse. He says that, I quote from my memory, the capital is, and this has something to do with the production of relative surplus value and the development of the forces of production. And my question would be, how would Majoret conceptualize this? Marx says capital is the pervasive contradiction in that it seeks to diminish the value of labor power, which is at the same time the source of value. Okay? This is capital's own contradiction, because with the development of the forces of production, which it has to progress in, this is its drive for surplus value and profit, it assumes a higher organic composition of capital. That means that the constant part of capital increases and the variable capital diminishes. Wages get lower, you have less labor inputs, you have less value, and it results in a crisis. And this is what Marx is trying to say. Capital is the contradiction because it already encapsulates the problem of crisis. Crisis is inherent as a contradiction to capital, and plus capital is never identical with itself. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this seems to be the Spinozist Majorean position here, that capital could at some point be identical with itself. Capital can never be identical with itself, for the simple reason that it is not even identical with itself if the reproduction of value and the circulation of surplus value is successful. Not even at that point is capital identical with itself, because it has to constantly expand. Capital never remains at the same level. So this would be my question. How does Majoret conceptualize the inherent contradiction of capital that capital cannot circumvent? Now I want to endorse what you said at the end, and I want to relate this to my first remark. Slave labor, of course, cannot produce value. How can somebody in his right mind question this? And this is even for somebody who's so well read in Marxian theory as the people you obviously have a discussion with. I've been having a discussion for ages with them. The problem is that these people, and it's so interesting, the new trends in leftist theory and Anglo theory about social reproduction theory and the communization trend, they do not understand the concept of wage. And this is where the problem comes in. Because if you don't understand how wage is constitutive to the production of value and surplus value, then you will not understand that slave labor cannot be productive of value. That is because wage is, by definition, necessary labor. And the division of the working day into necessary labor, which the worker needs for the production of her own needs, and surplus labor, this division is constitutive to the production of value. If we take the wage away, as they like to do, then we have a capital advance that only consists of constant capital. Then we only have constant capital. This is like Slaves are bought as commodities, so they are. You can basically say they are like machines. They don't receive a wage. This
Or
would be like.
animals, or
This would be
water
like.
power.
This would be like. This is exactly what's happening in the so-called digital revolution. The labor power is being substituted for machines and computerization and automatization. It does not produce value, and that's why capital has been in a crisis for 25 years. And it can't get out of this crisis because it does not understand that only living labor in the production process produces value. That is a problem. They do not understand that. And of course, I'm on your side, because the problem is that just one second. What happens in the production process, the living labor? What does the concept of living labor that is expressed in the wage form, the moneyed wage, they also don't understand money, is that the value is not only transferred as new value to the product, but also that at the point when the worker works at the machines, it's also restoring his or her own value. And this is what slaves do not do. And this is why Marx said the difference between a wage laborer and a slave is this, that the time that the wage laborer works for the capitalist looks as though the wage laborer works for herself. And the slave laborer, in the time that the slave works for himself, wait a minute, looks like the time he works for the capitalist. So it's it's reversed. But the slave does not work to restitute his own, reproduce his own labor power, because the means of reproduction are provided by the capitalist. They are not provided by the capitalist in the case of wage labor. So you can totally slash that argument that slave labor is productive of value. So this is where I want to do. But to come back to the first thing, exactly, this is the contradiction of capital, because capital wants only to consist of constant capital, and it will not produce any value whatsoever. And that is the fundamental contradiction. And please tell me how Mashure conceives of this.
Thanks. Those are really great and helpful points. I'm just excited that you agree with me, because I can't convince these people of what seems so obvious, and so I'm thinking that maybe this sort of a mode of presentation might actually get somewhere. Anyway, it's helped me to clarify those elements, because I'm taking the second point first, because the problem of the relation of slavery to capitalism, of the transition between the two, and of their categorical distinction, is not obviously the number one priority of Marx, who is making critique of capitalist mode of production. And so all of the many detailed comments that he has on slavery and like feudalism or other such comments are dispersed, and they're not systematically presented. And another thing that these people that I've been discussing with take up is that, in fact, there are 2 or 3 points across all of the manuscripts where Marx literally says slaves produce, or at least appears to say, you have to parse it in the context, but still something like slaves produce surplus value. And so they can say, well, Marx said it here, and etc. And so it seems really crucial to me to clearly present this argument is this point seems so obvious, and there are not that many elements of Marx's system required to prove or demonstrate the point that slaves can't produce surplus value, that it seems to me, who knows if anyone's mind will be changed, but certainly to put things in this sort of an order might be helpful. So that's a work in progress, and so I hope we'll see, but maybe next summer this is what I'm actually going to try to flesh out and fill in some real detail. And that goes back to the first point. I don't want to speak for Mashure, and as I maybe didn't make clear enough, he wrote this first text about the opening pages of Capital, his chapter in Reading Capital in 1965, and to my knowledge he hasn't maybe there's something I'm overlooking, but he hasn't gone back to write about Marx since then. He writes about Spinoza. He is one of the, in my view, one of the world's great Spinozists, and has really brought a lot to his doctrine, to our understanding of Spinoza. But he does so. One of his main contributions, I think, is that he maintains a rigorously materialist orientation in trying to think of Spinoza's system from the standpoint of materialism. And what is materialism if we understand it in a Spinozan mode? And I think that the proper an understanding of Spinoza's concept of substance is an immensely complex question, and immediately, of course, takes us right to the heart of what is material in materialism and how are we to understand it, etc. And so, to get to the point, to your question, one, I'm not going to try to speak for Macharet because he himself isn't really speaking about Marx's Capital for about 50 years, and when he did, he was still a student, and he says this is just a student thing of mine that's worthless, even though I disagree. But so let's not speak for him. But I think the simple, or let's say the fundamental point, I think, to take from those 100 pages in that last chapter is that he is not making an abstract negation or refusal of the concept of contradiction, whether in Spinoza or, I'm saying, taking from that analysis if we look in Marx, but rather trying to set certain limitations and put it in a certain place. And his argument for Spinoza, in any case, is that contradiction is deployed by Spinoza, but in matters of existence. For example, the analysis of the human body for Spinoza, and I said, well, the body of capitalism as well. And so there, the concept of contradiction is explicitly deployed and developed by Spinoza, but it is not appropriate or adequate to the adequate understanding of essence as a cause of itself, causa sui. And so all the points that you make are of course crucial, and the claim isn't that there is no theory of contradiction in Capital. That would be absurd, but rather to raise this sort of a reading of Spinoza can lead us to ask the question of what is the adequate domain and appropriate points at which contradiction functions, and how does it function in the various structures, and moreover, is this distinction that we find in Spinoza between contradiction as a functional category in the domain of existence, but not essence, is that also appropriate or not in Capital? So that's a big question. But simply to underscore that point, that it's not an abstract rejection of contradiction in the structure or the argument or the categories of Capital, but rather a question about what is the domain of their function in the various modes of demonstration, which are not only negative dialectical. And already in the 1965 article, that's what I think is so interesting, even though it's just a short little paper, that he's identifying in the first 5 pages conceptual movement that isn't negative dialectical. So in this 1965 context of the rejection of humanism, etc., that makes it, I think, very interesting.
Who else wants to ask a question? Joe?
Yes, just to follow up on this, so I'm sorry, because Peter's paper was really interesting and there's a lot to ask about that, but since we're on this topic, I just, Nick, you've really gotten me thinking with this, this sort of, it feels like a thought experiment. What if Spinoza had written Capital?
Yeah.
but it's fascinating, but I'm also still having trouble seeing dialectics in this. Partly this is due to my admitted relative lack of expertise on Spinoza, but I guess, I mean, I also think I read Spinoza a bit differently than Marcheret did, which probably means certainly not with as much expertise, but I mean, to me, what's kind of the big negation contained within Spinoza's ethics is that he uses this method that's taken from Christian scholasticism and seems to be entirely consistent, more consistent than anyone else, in order to draw the reader in who accepts this method and to prove something that the reader isn't expecting. So
I
not
mean the geometrical synthetic method.
Yeah, so not to prove what's obvious, like that in this case, it's obvious that slaves don't produce value, but to prove surplus value, but to prove what's not obvious, you know, the scholasticists think that they've proven the existence of God, and Spinoza actually said, well, okay, but God is a completely different thing than you thought God was. So it almost is like a parody of itself. It has that kind of negation. And maybe that's an idiosyncratic understanding of Spinoza, but still, if there's another kind of dialectical negation that we're taking from Spinoza, I'm not sure, I don't quite see or understand in what way that's preserved if we use it for telling Marx's capital in a more straightforward, sort of less inconsistent or less contradictory way. I sort of feel like here Spinoza is taking the contradictions out, but maybe I'm misunderstanding your intention.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll be quick. When I was thinking at first about how would I approach this, I was surprised when I looked up the French definition of dialectique in my little Robert here, and it simply says, I'm translating here, the set of means put into operation, mise en œuvre, in discussion with a view to demonstrating or refuting, and that is to say a general definition. But then I went and I reread the Marcheret, and so I thought maybe that's it. We're just simply dialectic here in this book for Spinoza is simply a mode of reasoning, of demonstration, etc. It's not necessarily based on contradiction, on whatever you want, syllogism or anything else, but simply as a mode of reasoning. And I'm not sure myself that Marcheret makes any kind of a substantial argument for why what he's discussing should be called dialectics or dialectical or positive dialectics, but he makes that claim repeatedly, and so I take your point. I think it's something maybe to think about further, whether the term retains any real purchase if you're applying it in this way. I think then in terms of the little synthetic presentation that I patched together on slavery and value and surplus value, it seems to me that Spinoza's point in adopting this mode of presentation is precisely that. So I'm trying to, in a rhetorical way, I'm trying to convince these people. It seems patently obvious to me that they're completely wrong, and I have very smart people on my side agreeing, but that doesn't matter. And so rhetorically, there's a problem here, and the ethics itself is a project in the transformation of our capacity for thinking adequately, and so that then this sort of a structure, my hope is that if it can be put together in such a clear fashion, step by step, with something that really doesn't have that many elements in its demonstration, that it might have some kind of a rhetorical effect in convincing people that this is absolutely and adequately true and demonstrable, that slave labor, if we accept Marx's basic propositions, the substance of value, wage labor, etc., that this is the case. So it's not simply a formal, abstract, grid to put on top of things. It's very much an ethical, rhetorical problem, and that it might help with.